Well, thank you very much, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here in Little Rock, and I've been really well taken care of. I surveyed Moss Mountain Farm with Alan yesterday and got a glimpse of his great gardening empire. Alan made a wonderful dinner with kale and sweet potatoes and greens from the garden and heirloom chickens. So that was quite a treat. And Laura Leach, his assistant, has been the most marvelous of handlers for this old dad during my visit here to Little Rock. And so it's a great joy to be here. I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson's vegetable garden. I'm not sure that Jefferson needs too much of an introduction. He, of course, was the third president of the United States and the author of the Declaration of Independence. During his presidency, the Lewis and Clark expedition was choreographed by Jefferson, and the Louisiana Purchase, perhaps part of this land as well. But Jefferson's perhaps best known as being sort of America's essential Renaissance man, and some of you might be familiar with the famous quip by John Kennedy when he was hosting a dinner for Nobel Prize laureates in the White House, and he said this was the greatest meeting of minds in the White House since Thomas Jefferson had eaten here by himself. And what's remarkable about his lifelong home, Monticello, as a lover of the classics, as a paleontologist, a meteorologist, a scientist, and particularly I think you see him as a gardener. And if I did one thing in my long-term tenure at Monticello, it was, I think, to show people how few topics tell us more about Thomas Jefferson than gardening. And there are a lot of different dimensions to his interest. His overseer, a man named Edmund Bacon, said that the flowers at Monticello bloomed virtually every month of the year. And when people came to visit Jefferson at Monticello, they were regularly given tours of what one visitor referred to as Mr. Jefferson's pet trees. Jefferson documented the planting of 170 varieties of the finest fancy fruit that was known in the early 19th century. And his legacy as a grape grower and a lover of fine wine is constantly recalled today by this burgeoning Virginia wine industry. There's some 200 wineries now within an hour's drive of Monticello, and it's becoming a little bit of the Napa Valley of the East. And Jefferson said remarkable things like, "No nation is drunken when wine is cheap, and wine is indispensable to my health." So his legacy is a very handy one for this new industry that's becoming very, very powerful now in our part of the world. But it was really Jefferson's vegetable garden that was really his chief horticultural achievement of his horticultural life at Monticello. When Jefferson used the word garden, he was reserving the term exclusively for this 1,000-foot-long terrace that was literally hewed out of the side of the southeastern slope of the mountain. This was really Jefferson's retirement garden between the ages of 67 and 83, between 1809, when he retired from the presidency, until his death in 1826. It was for Jefferson sort of a rage against the pathos of aging that drove him into the garden, a barometer of his health, to be able to go into the garden and sow peas, or write down in his garden diary when it was salsify was being harvested in October of 1814. Even at the age of 82 years old, Jefferson read about giant cucumbers, 7 feet long, in a Cleveland, Ohio newspaper. And he wrote to the governor of Ohio and asked him for seeds of these giant cucumbers, and in Jeffersonian form, he gave them out to his friends and neighbors and planted them in his garden and measured how long each one was. And Jefferson once wrote that, although an old man, I am but a young gardener. And here he was at the age of 82, I think, very much playing this role of a open-eyed, wide-eyed young gardener, but also at 82 years old, certainly an old man in many, many ways. And these are really a long gourd, but this could have been Jefferson's 7 to 8 foot long cucumbers that he was talking about. Jefferson's participation in the gardening process was really rather remarkable. Jefferson was a lifelong slaveholder. He described slavery as an abominable crime, and his role as a slaveholder as being like holding the wolf by the ears, that holding on, at least in his opinion, was necessary for self-preservation. And certainly enslaved African Americans did the lion's share of the labor in the gardens at Monticello, but there were a lot of exceptions. Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters gardened in the flower gardens and the vegetable garden. Jefferson had a few itinerant European gardeners, professionals who worked in the orchards and the vineyards. And then Jefferson actually did a lot of work with his own hands. Isaac Jefferson was freed by Jefferson's family years after Jefferson died, and he went on to become a blacksmith in Petersburg, Virginia, where he left an oral history of life at Monticello during Jefferson's lifetime. And he recalled that Jefferson himself would work at a right hard pace in the cool of the evening in what Isaac called right good earnest. And another friend of Jefferson's was a woman named Margaret Bayard Smith, who is what we call today a Washington socialite. And she recalled visiting Monticello and seeing a portable seed rack that was carried from planting site to planting site. And on the seed rack were hundreds of glass vials and tin canisters of seed from which Jefferson would take and actually sow the vegetable crops himself with his own hands. And Jefferson's regarded as among the more cerebral figures in American history, but he actually was a pretty handy guy. He was a great surveyor, and this is a memorandum from 1810 when Jefferson was some 67 years old. And he was out in the garden. He did this constantly, redoing the beds in the garden with surveying them out. And he had a theodolite, which is like a transit that measures angles. And he also had a chain, which measured distances. And one could see Jefferson out in the garden in February. His boots were probably covered with Albemarle County red clay. He was probably a little arthritic, a little bent with age. He was aided surely by the man who's sometimes called Monticello's head gardener, an enslaved African-American named Wormley Hughes, who was sort of a larger-than-life figure at Monticello. But one can see Jefferson, laying out the garden and moving the transit from one angle to another, and then telling Wormley to pull that chain tight and drive a stake at that particular corner of one of these beds in his vegetable garden. Isaac himself recalled that Jefferson was as good a hand as any man I've ever known in terms of making locks and keys with brass and iron in the Monticello blacksmith shop. So it's another dimension to Jefferson that he was, his participation, his actual gardening was really a little bit more than a typical gentleman farmer of the day. Jefferson was a great record keeper. One of the first things you learn about him is his obsession with the details of the natural world. He kept a weather journal, an account book. He wrote 21,000 letters, and scholars have always wondered, how did this man get anything done? So busy was he writing all these things down. And this is a page from Jefferson's garden book, which is a 66-page diary that's bound in leather and today resides at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And this is a page from his garden book in 1812 in which he's organizing his entire garden, that is his vegetable garden, into these three tidy categories according to which part of the plant was being harvested, whether fruits, roots, or leaves. So here's Jefferson. He was a great believer in categorizing the world around him, believing that the observation and defining of the natural world would lead to human progress and ultimately to human happiness. And here he is organizing the whole vegetable world into these three really tidy categories according to which part of the plant was being harvested. A real window, I think, into the mind of Thomas Jefferson. And another page from the garden book, a little bit more difficult to see, but this is from 1809, his calendar of plantings, and there's some 47 vegetable varieties being planted. And then you can see in the middle column the repetition of the word failed, some 17 times. And one could perhaps say that few gardeners failed as often as Thomas Jefferson, or at least who wrote about it as often as he did. And Jefferson also wrote one gardening experiments at Monticello that one success was worth the 99 failures. When the Hessian fly was eating Jefferson's and destroying his wheat crop at Monticello, Jefferson seemed much more concerned about learning the life cycle of this destructive insect rather than the fact that his wheat crop was about to go down the drain. Jefferson's daughter, Martha, when Jefferson was away in Philadelphia serving as Secretary of State, wrote him a letter in which she complained about the insects ravaging her cabbage plants as fast as she could set them out in the garden. And so Jefferson responded by saying, well, the two of us this next winter are going to cover the entire garden with a really heavy coating of manure. He said, when plants are growing in rich soil, they will in turn, in Jefferson's words, bid defiance to all sorts of droughts and insect pests and diseases and weeds and all the things that malign our gardens during a long, hot summer in central Virginia. He not only was carrying the banner of the organic gardening movement, he didn't have too many alternatives at the time, but he believed in this sort of wholesome balance between wild nature on the one hand and the cultivated garden on the other. He had a real kind of holistic view of the gardening process and of working with nature. And sometimes today, after a long, hot summer, we end up using military images to describe the gardening process. We're out to blast these weeds or wipe out these insects. So it's nice to fall back upon Jefferson's more balanced belief in that inevitable tension that exists between wild nature and the cultivated garden. Jefferson planted arbors in his vegetable garden of different flowers of flowering bean, different colors. He reveled in things like the Calabash bean, which he said was the most delicious flowering bean in the world. He planted purple and white eggplants in adjacent rows and edged his tomatoes with okra. He reveled in odd-colored vegetables and multi-headed cabbages and other curiosities of the natural vegetable world. And in the garden book, one really sees Jefferson's looking at gardening as sort of adventure. And the garden book really reveals one man's dance in some ways with the elements themselves. This was an American garden in a lot of ways, and its size, its scale, and scope was really large, enormous. It was big. This 1,000-foot-long terrace was literally hewed out of the side of the mountain by 7 slaves that Jefferson hired from a Petersburg, Virginia farmer. And over a period of 3 years, they moved the dirt, some 400,000 cubic feet of earth, to create this level platform, what one visitor called a hanging garden. And Edmund Bacon, Jefferson's overseer, was in charge, and Jefferson would write Bacon regularly as he was anticipating coming home from the presidency to get this garden completed. The 1,000-foot-long terrace was supported by a 1,000-foot-long stone wall that some places was almost 15 feet in height. And at the halfway point of the garden, at the halfway point of the wall, was this garden pavilion, or garden temple I'll talk about a little bit later. Then below the garden was a 400-tree orchard that surrounded 2 vineyards, and the whole complex was surrounded by a 10-foot-high fence that ran for nearly 4,000 feet. So this was really a big, big garden, B-E-E-G. It was big. It also was, I think, very much an experimental garden. Jefferson once wrote that the greatest service which can be rendered in any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. And he documented planting some 330 varieties of vegetables and 170 varieties of fruit. This garden became truly an Ellis Island, if you will, of new and unusual plants that were brought literally from the 4 corners of the globe. And Jefferson, in turn, became sort of a seedy missionary, as he would get rare seeds and plants from plantsmen from around the world. And then he'd share them with fellow politicians and neighbors and some of the great plantsmen of the early Republic of the United States. From the Texas bird pepper that Jefferson got from an American Army captain who was stationed in San Antonio, Texas, to the sesame plant growing here next to the garden pavilion. And Jefferson was primarily a vegetarian. He wrote that he ate meat only as a condiment to his meals. And he was always seeking a good vegetable oil. And when he was serving as president, he conducted a blind tasting of different kinds of salad oils. And when people liked the sesame oil better than any other type, it set off a typically mad Jeffersonian obsession with growing sesame year in and year out and sending seeds to everybody he knew with comments about how it was the most important plant that had ever been introduced to American gardens. And he devised 3 different presses in order to extract an oil from the seed itself. Or the Chou de Milan cabbage, a variegated Savoy cabbage that's very, very beautiful that Jefferson sent home from Paris when he was serving as minister to France. To the modest rutabaga in the upper right-hand corner. And it's hard to prove, really, that Jefferson was the first person to grow any particular type of vegetable, but a good case could be made that he was the first American to grow rutabagas. Thomas Jefferson, rutabaga man. I think, thirdly, this garden is an American garden in sort of the continental panorama in which it existed. As you look to the southeast, for some 50 miles toward Richmond, Virginia, across the rolling Virginia Piedmont, a view that one visitor referred to as the sea view because it resembles a vision out into the ocean. Or if you look in the other direction to the southwest and you see the dramatic uplift of this adjacent mountain called Monte Alto, and Monticello, of course, means little mountain in Italian, while this mountain, about 400 feet higher, was called Monte Alto, the high mountain. And at least 2 visitors to Monticello referred to this garden pavilion or garden temple as an observatory. So one gets a sense about how this garden was really a consciously designed perch for Jefferson to look out upon what he called the workhouse of nature. He wrote, "How sublime to look down upon the workhouse of nature, clouds, thunder, lightning, all fabricated at our feet." This was a revolutionary garden in a lot of different ways. One wonders if any man had grown so many different kinds of vegetables before Jefferson assembled this collection at Monticello over some 50 years of gardening. And most gardens in Virginia around 1800 were bare of vegetables in the summertime. They were relying on traditional European crops that do best in our cool fall or cool springtime, but suffer in a long, hot summer. Root crops like turnips and beets, or salad greens like lettuce or cabbage family members. And what Jefferson did that was really unique was he assembled this collection of new hot weather vegetables that were really well suited for our long, hot Virginia summer. From things we take for granted today, from tomatoes to hot and sweet peppers, from eggplants to okra, from butter beans or lima beans to peanuts, from sweet potatoes to Crowder peas. And the real genius of the garden itself is the microclimate. It faces to the southeast. It captures this wealth of crop ripening sunshine, but also enabled Jefferson to not only successfully grow these hot weather vegetables all summer long, but also to extend the growing season throughout the winter months. Jefferson would regularly plant lettuce and spinach and endive and kales and cabbage family members in the fall to harvest throughout the winter months. It really resembles a climate hundreds and hundreds of miles to the south. In addition, when you have a small mountain, the elevation of Monticello, in the spring and the fall, the cold air tends to settle in low places while the warm air rises up the 810 feet that we have at Monticello. And Jefferson would regularly gloat over the fact that his neighbors' fruit trees were all killed by frost while his own remained unscathed. And we often don't have a frost in this garden until well into December, although we're much further north than y'all are here. It was also, I think, a revolutionary garden, and it was a very pragmatic, practical garden. It wasn't a fussy garden. It wasn't heavily maintained. Jefferson didn't have this huge staff of slaves out edging beds and rolling walkways and weeding the garden. Jefferson, in his garden book, never talked about how he took care of plants. It's all about sowing new things and then harvesting them for the table. He has this column called "Come to Table," the date in which every vegetable was harvested. So it had sort of this pragmatic American experimental feel to it that was not really an old world kitchen garden, but was sort of a new American practical garden in so many ways. This revolutionary garden, I think, really inspired a revolutionary cuisine in the kitchen at Monticello. And we know a lot about food at Monticello from recipes that were written down by Jefferson's granddaughters that were copied from their mother, Martha, Martha Jefferson, Jefferson's daughter. And among the recipes is a fascinating one for okra soup, in effect gumbo. And the vegetables in this are really interesting because you have two crops, patty pan squash and lima beans, that were grown by American Indians when the first Europeans arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s. You have tomatoes, which were found by the Spanish in Central America and became popular really early in the Mediterranean region. And you have potatoes, an unusual ingredient in gumbo, but one in this recipe. And potatoes were again found by the Spanish in the Andes, and they became popular when brought into Europe, not in the Mediterranean region, but in northern Europe, in the British Isles. It was all brought together by an African plant, okra, that had been brought across the Atlantic by means of the slave trade in slave ships. Okra cuisine was creolized by the French in the Caribbean, and then slaves brought seeds into southern seaports. Then this whole dish was put together in the Monticello kitchen by enslaved African-American chefs. And they'd been trained in the finest arts of French cuisine, both in in the kitchens of Paris, but also in the president's house, where Jefferson's French chef, a guy named Honoré Julien, trained John Hemmings to be a sophisticated chef. So what a great amalgam of all these traditions that not only went into the garden, but then came into the kitchen and reflected sort of our eclectic American cuisine and really began to define who we are as Virginians and as Southerners, as Americans. When Jefferson was president, he kept a master plan of presidential meals, and it was written in French. It was probably copied down verbatim from his French chef. But among the recipes is one for what could be called French fries. And there's a lot of fake lore about Jefferson being the first to do this and first to do that. But a good case could be made that, at least by means of his French chef, Jefferson was the first American to serve French fries. And this is a remarkable chart from Jefferson's garden book detailing during the 8 years of his presidency. He kept this chart of the first and last appearance of some 37 different vegetables in the farmers market in Washington, D.C., when they first came in and when they disappeared. A remarkable window into early American vegetable cuisine, but according to one of Jefferson's friends, he would go around to foreign embassies, and they would vie with each other to give Jefferson the most unusual type of vegetable, and he would get the seeds of these crops and pass them out to local farmers with directions on how to grow them. And then he in turn ordered his French maitre d', who did the shopping at the farmer's market, to pay the highest prices for the prettiest broccoli or the earliest cabbages that came into the market. So we look for models today for this farm-to-table movement. Here was Jefferson, fostering local agriculture and farmers and gardeners some 200 years ago. But Jefferson's garden wasn't the only garden at Monticello. Slaves had their own garden out on the plantation that they would cultivate on Sundays and even in the evenings. And then on Sunday mornings, they would sell the produce to the Jefferson family. And Jefferson's wife and his daughter and his granddaughters and he himself all kept logs of the purchases of things like cucumbers and potatoes and squashes and cabbages from enslaved African Americans. It was a sort of part of their underground economy. It enabled these people to have extra money for buying food or buying fancy items for their wives. And it's an amazing sort of intersection of black and white worlds. This is Jefferson's granddaughter, Anne Carey Randolph. And between 1805 and 1808, between the ages of 14 and 17, her job on Sunday morning was to buy vegetables from the slaves. And one wonders at this intersection of black and white worlds, who was driving the hard bargain? This 14-year-old girl whose job as a rite of passage was to do this, or one of these wizened, experienced slave gardeners whose sort of secondary livelihood was dependent upon requiring some monies for extra things. A lot of the vegetables were sold to the Jefferson family out of season. That is, cucumbers were sold in February and apples in April. suggesting that a lot of these vegetables were preserved effectively so that they were sold to the Jefferson family when they were of most value. And the gardens were out on the 5,000-acre plantation. This is actually Monticello, the little mountain. And Jefferson drew a map in 1794 designating this sort of level part of an adjacent farm as Abram's garden. And so we get a little sense of where these gardens were. And it's just an interesting aspect. It took place not just at Monticello, but at other plantations in Virginia in the late 18th and early 19th century. The real stars of the garden are in some ways the vegetables themselves. The English pea was probably Jefferson's favorite vegetable. He had heavily choreographed pea planting season in the springtime with early and mid and late season varieties that were planted at staggered times throughout the springtime. Jefferson had a second home called Poplar Forest, and it's near Lynchburg, Virginia, about 60 miles away. And Jefferson built this retreat home to get away from all the celebrity tourists who were coming to visit him at Monticello. And according to Jefferson's daughter, his neighbors would go out of their way to have early gardens so that when Jefferson arrived in the late spring, they would be able to give him as a gift fresh peas from their gardens. It became a vegetable associated with Thomas Jefferson. He also had famous contests with his neighbors to see who could bring the first English pea to table in the springtime, the winner hosting the loser over for a community supper that, of course, included a feast on the winning dish of peas. And the family story is that Jefferson rarely won the contest. He had a neighbor who maybe was his best friend outside the world of politics. His name was George Divers. And he lived at what is now Farmington Country Club, and Jefferson actually designed this octagon room in the portico to the house itself. And Divers was a great gardener. He regarded himself as the king of the pea contest in the springtime. And when Jefferson brought the first pea to table in 1814, he refused to divulge the fact to Mr. Divers in fear of rocking the pride of his very best friend. Jefferson's granddaughter said that Jefferson himself was the least competitive gardener of any person she'd ever known. And Divers had a very important role because when Jefferson would kill things at Monticello or else he would lose the seed, he could always go to Divers and get replacements. He'd write him and say, well, do you remember that black-eyed pea I brought home from France in 1787? Do you have any replacements for those? So it's a great lesson for all gardeners to share what you have because it can come back to rehabilitate your own garden at some point. And this is Mary Randolph. We also know a lot about food from her. She was Jefferson's second cousin. She ran a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. And she wrote a book that's been called the most influential cookbook of the 19th century, called The Virginia Housewife. And it has recipes for all these unusual things that Jefferson was growing at Monticello. And her peas were simply boiled and served with mint and butter and onion. Jefferson's granddaughter, Anne, who I showed you an image of earlier, she boiled and then sauteed her fresh peas and sauteed them with egg yolk, onions, cloves, and brown sugar to make sort of a sweet custardy sauce. And it sounds a little awful, but it's really pretty good if you have fresh peas. Lettuce was a big deal at Monticello. Jefferson one year documented sowing lettuce 23 different occasions. He documented harvesting lettuce every month of the year. And surely his summer lettuce was probably a little milky, a little bitter, and it was probably boiled like you would spinach. But when he was late in his life, he published this gardening guide in a national periodical called The American Farmer. And it's a rather modest calendar of advice on what to do during the various months of the gardening season. But among Jefferson's pearls of wisdom was to sow a thimbleful of lettuce every Monday morning from February 1st to September 1st. So think about this a little bit. The first thing you do when you get up during the work week is you go up and you sow a thimbleful of lettuce, as if that's a life lesson akin to cleaning your dinner plate or and eating. Doing that every morning, every Monday morning sowing would lead to all the good things in life like longevity and moral virtue. And Jefferson sowed lettuce some 160 times during his retirement years, and about 115 of them were done on Mondays. So he practiced to some extent what he preached. This was a favorite of his, this brown Dutch lettuce that he would regularly sow in September to harvest through the winter months. And tennis ball lettuce was another favorite, and he reserved this for his second home at Poplar Forest because he said it didn't require as much attention as other sorts. Cabbage was a real garden workhorse at Monticello. Jefferson documented some 33 different varieties. Mary Randolph in her cookbook said that cabbage should be as beautiful dressed as when growing in the garden. Dressed meaning cooked or prepared. Jefferson had a personal recipe for stuffed cabbage. And one year in December 24th of 1822, in his account book, Jefferson mentioned buying 79 cabbages from Gil Gillette. Gil Gillette was an enslaved African American, and one wonders, again, at this intersection of black and white worlds, what Jefferson was doing on Christmas Eve buying 79 cabbages. Were these presents for the community at Monticello? Were they decorations for the house? Were they just the source of a huge quantity of Monticello-based coleslaw? When Jefferson was about to retire from the presidency, he wrote his daughter Martha and said, "Gosh, I can't wait to come home to my friends and my family and my books, and particularly I can't wait until we can sow our cabbages together." So this really modest vegetable was used as sort of an image of familial happiness. This was a favorite of Jefferson's called sea kale, a perennial cabbage that grows wild on the beaches of Great Britain. In the springtime, the sea kale emerges from the ground, and as it begins to grow, it's often covered by shifting wind-driven beach sand. And what that does is it prevents the production of chlorophyll and reduces the bitterness and the taste of the leaf itself and makes it really very delectable in some ways. And gardeners, as an alternative, used sea kale pots when they brought sea kale into the garden, and they'd cover the plant as it came up from in the springtime. And then when I got to be 8 or 10 inches high, it was cut off, and according to Jefferson, it was prepared like asparagus. And Jefferson spent a lot more time in the garden than he did in the kitchen, and whenever he'd send away some particular new plant, he'd always say, "Well, prepare that like you would asparagus." So his cooking range may not have been that broad. And then later on in the season, like asparagus, you let the plant grow to produce some food for the next year's emergence in the springtime. And Jefferson bought 180 pots from a Richmond potter for his sea kale. And although his initial plantings failed, in 1818, Jefferson received 200 plants of sea kale from a friend and neighbor named General John Hartwell Cock. And all of a sudden, in Jefferson's garden book, you see yearly notations of when his first sea kale came to the table and when it was no longer ready for the table. So again, Cock lived at a place called Bremo, about 50 miles southeast of Monticello on the James River. Everywhere where Jefferson failed, Cock was successful as a farmer, as a slaveholder, as a gardener. And again, friends came to the rescue for Thomas Jefferson's garden with Cock's shipment of sea kale. Jefferson spelled tomatoes Tomatas, suggesting he pronounced them tomatas. He grew them as a culinary vegetable for some 24 years. There's 17 recipes for tomato cuisine in the Jefferson family manuscripts. When the tomato was first brought into Europe, it sort of blew the minds of the earliest commentators on the natural world. And the tomato is sort of a sensual plant with these long, vining, stinky leaves and this sort of large, red, lap-wetting fruit. In some ways, it was kind of too sexy for its own good. And these earliest commentators were almost medieval in their awe of this new vegetable, and so, unfortunately, it became associated with other members of the nightshade family. And even as late as the 1840s and 1850s, Englishmen would write about tomatoes as something that was only eaten by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French, but no civilized person would touch them. So there was sort of a nativism associated with the tomato. Here's a 1794 tomato that was grown by Charles Wilson Peale, a very prominent early American portrait painter from Philadelphia. Jefferson's son-in-law was really a great gardener. His name was Thomas Mann Randolph, He gave a speech before a local progressive agricultural society called the Albemarle Agricultural Society in 1823. And he talked about plant introduction, how new plants were improving everybody's lives. And he said that 10 years earlier, no one was growing tomatoes in Charlottesville. But he said now, by 1823, he said everyone was growing tomatoes because people believed they quickened the blood in the summertime. So it was the medicinal value of the tomato that led to its acceptance as a great tasting vegetable. This is a variety called purple Calabash that we grow in the gardens at Monticello. And then in the rear, there's one called Castelluto Genovese, which is an Italian heirloom that's very productive. Turnips were sort of queen of the garden in the 18th and 19th century. They were very versatile. They could be harvested all season long. There's a wonderful recipe in the Jefferson family manuscripts for boiling the turnips and then mashing them with cheese. Kind of Monticello comfort food with cheese and turnips. People commonly planted turnips in a variety of places. This is the garden of Landon Carter, who was the richest man in Virginia around the time of the American Revolution. And it was considered the most ornate flower garden at the time in Virginia. And it was the topmost terrace of a series of terraces that went down to the Rappahannock River, which we can't see in this image because of the trees. And we're looking from his house, which was called Sabin Hall. And Carter was this cranky guy, and he went out one summer, and his flowers were all burned up by this horrible drought, and he wasn't feeling good. He had a bad case of gout. And so he said, well, I'm going to tear up my flowers. I'm going to plant turnips. And it was sort of his revenge on the world. And he said, well, at least I can eat the turnips. And today we, of course, have these edible landscaping people who urge us to get rid of our wasteful lawns. And two of Jefferson's other contemporaries tore up their lawns around their house and planted turnips. John Hartwell Cock, who I showed you earlier, and another contemporary of Jefferson. So it was this edible landscaping was going on a long, long time ago. Unfortunately, I'm not sure people would do it with turnips today. Turnips kind of resides a lowly place in our culinary imagination. Unfortunately, this was a root crop that was a great favorite of the Jefferson family, salsify or oyster plant. And Jefferson's granddaughter talked about boiling the roots of this and then mashing them up and breading them and then frying them, she said, like sausages. And it is a nice cross between an artichoke heart and a oyster. It's really a pretty good vegetable. And cucumbers always had trouble coming up with a vegetable that Jefferson did not like. I was stumped one time when I was asked if there was a vegetable he didn't like, and I couldn't come up with anything. But a good possibility might be cucumbers, although he said it was a great favorite of his, and he bought amazing quantities from his slaves at Monticello. But Jefferson's search for the giant cucumber really wasn't unique. Before Jefferson was even born, there was an avid gardener in Williamsburg, Virginia, named John Custis. And he got seeds of a cucumber called the turkey cucumber, and he planted them in his garden, and the cucumbers turned out to be 7, 8, 9 feet long. And there was a story in the local newspaper, the Virginia Gazette, about how people were riding their horses 10 and 15 miles to see these giant cucumbers. And this man in Boston read about these giant cucumbers in the Virginia Gazette. And so he wrote a letter back and said, yeah, I want to see your giant cucumbers, but wait till you see the 800-pound watermelons we grew up here in Massachusetts. So it set off this sort of mock civil war about who had the biggest vegetable, and it shows you how boys will be boys. Here's a 17th century, early 17th century cucumber that doesn't look like the smooth-shaped torpedo character ones we grow today. And the West Indian gherkin was a pickling cucumber for Jefferson. He planted it in the hot season in the garden. It was introduced into Virginia by enslaved African Americans. And when Jefferson was president, his maitre d' recorded buying barrels of gherkins for the president's house. And visitors to the president's house were welcome to take what they wanted from the gherkin barrel as they entered the building. The restoration of this garden took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and and here I was when I came in 1977, a young puppy, involved not only in the restoration of this fruit and vegetable garden, but also also I took care of it for 35 years, so I had sort of a unique perspective on the nature of this garden itself. And here's a view of Monticello in 1975, and it always cheered me up when I used to work at Monticello and get depressed about all the death, disease, and destruction I'd sometimes encounter. And here's the terrace itself, and it was used as a cut flower garden for arrangements in the house, but it was truncated, and Jefferson's original garden extended all the way out to here. And one of the great advantages of the restoration of this garden was our ability to remove these acres of asphalt parking lot, really an intrusion on the historical experience. And here you see this bus, just some 35 feet from the south portico, running its buses on a hot July day. So we used garden archaeology extensively in the restoration. Every time you disturb our heavy red clay soil, you leave some sort of lasting imprint in terms of the texture or the color of the soil itself, so that archaeologists, by very carefully troweling off the soil, can see stains in the ground. And in this aerial view, you can see in the left center of your screen these little white dots where the archaeologists put newspaper over where they found the stains that represented where Jefferson's apple and peach trees were planted in his south orchard. And the pattern that emerged was identical to a map that Jefferson had drawn of this south orchard in 1778. And then along the left-hand part of your screen, you can see a closer spacing of these white dots, and that reflects this, this garden fence, 10 feet high, that ran 4,000 feet and surrounded this entire 10-acre complex. And the boards, according to Jefferson, were to be placed so close together that not even a young hare or rabbit could get between them. I believe a young rabbit could get between those, but that was our best effort at recreating this fence. And really a dominating feature of the landscape. And archaeologists spent some 3 years uncovering the entire garden wall, and here's an extant section of it. The story was that during the civilian conservation crew's work at Monticello in the 1930s, they stole a lot of the stone from the wall in order to build a modern-day exit road wall. And then here's the foundation or the footing for that garden pavilion at the halfway point of the garden, perched kind of precariously atop that wall. And the story goes it was blown down in a rather violent windstorm a few years after Jefferson died. It's a 10.5-foot cube with this triple sash windows and a Chinese railing around the roof and a kind of a peaked roof at the middle. It supposedly was also a favorite place for Jefferson to read in the cool of the evening. But a beautiful sort of ornamental structure for this very practical garden. The garden has inspired a lot of people. It's inspired a lot of art over the years. Here's an aerial view of the rows in the garden from the really from the 1980s. And a Chicago artist named Laura Nicholson did a tapestry of this aerial view that this image doesn't really do justice, because this tapestry is some 15 feet long. And it is a great scale model of that aerial view of the garden. A real great work of art, and it hung at the Chicago Institute of Art for years. And here's one of her tapestries of the produce from the garden, the root crops that were harvested in the fall of 1994. And Annie Leibovitz might be the most famous photographer in the world, and she came to Monticello just 2 years ago to do a book called Pilgrimages. But she was only interested in taking pictures of vegetables. And so I'd go out in the garden with her, and I'd dig up some sweet potatoes, and I'd throw them on the ground, and she'd take a picture of the sweet potatoes. And I'd do the same thing with beets or turnips or a variety of other root crops. And I was complaining while I was doing this because I was working on the book, and I said, well, you know, I'm having trouble getting a professional photographer to be here at the right time when everything looks really beautiful and the light's perfect and the garden is well taken care of. And she said, oh, you know, you have a great eye. You should be taking your own pictures. So she gave me her camera, which is sort of like, you know, having Babe Ruth's bat, having Annie Leibovitz's camera. Unfortunately, it's not affected my skills as a photographer, and my 20-year-old daughter really has to show me how to use it a lot of times. But this is an image she did of the southwest end of the garden in about this time of year, 2 years ago at Monticello. And Alice Waters is sort of the mother of this farm-to-table movement, and She started the Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley in the late 60s and has been a great advocate for schoolyard gardens and for the use of organic produce and fresh food that's locally sourced. And she also believes that food is a means to develop community. And she came just a year and a half ago and made a meal at Monticello for some 300 people on the west lawn, and she described it as the most important meal she'd ever made. And here she is washing lettuce with our gardeners, and Eleanor here looks a little askance at Alice's lettuce cleaning techniques. But she brought 6 chefs from around the world and had some cows. She was milking the cows, and it was quite a work of art, this meal that she prepared. And Michelle Obama said perhaps the most important thing she'd ever done was the White House kitchen garden. And when she first came to the White House, she brought with them this guy, Sam Cass, who was the personal chef for the Obama family in Chicago. And he was put in charge of the White House Food Initiative, charged with creating this White House kitchen garden and also developing programs to help curb childhood obesity and getting children to eat healthier foods and to get them out moving around. And he came to Monticello and was really impressed with the garden and the Jefferson legacy, and he came back to the White House and with Jefferson's favorite vegetable varieties, from the tennis ball lettuce to the Marseille fig. And they dedicated a special section of the garden to the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. And he was sort of a rookie gardener, and he liked the quote about the failure of one thing repaired by the success of another. And for a number of years, I'd go up and plant the garden in sort of a ceremonial planting with Mrs. Obama and some 60 or 70 school children. And at this really difficult period of our history with this incredible paralysis in our political system, it was just sort of a life-confirming, affirming thing to go to the White House and plant a garden with school children. Jefferson was first in food and first in wine and first in gardening. He could easily be described as America's first foodie. And at Monticello, we've been trying to engage new audiences who are interested in things like organic gardening and sustainable farming and seed saving and local food. And we have a festival every spring that uses the legacy of Jefferson, a festival in the fall, that uses the legacy of Thomas Jefferson to celebrate this new interest in the farm-to-table movement. And this is the book that I will be happy to assign for you after I finish talking, and it's published by Yale University Press. It's done well. It's won a bunch of awards. It's in its 3rd printing. Alice Waters wrote the introduction for it, and it's a nice combination of a work of scholarship, but also it's a pretty book that has some of my nicest pictures, but mostly a professional photographer's nicer pictures. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So do you want to use the microphone? Here's some people. This gentleman right here would like to ask a question.
Do you have any information on how he dealt with the wildlife losses attributed to them?
Well, I showed you the fence which he wanted to put up to keep the bunnies out. Deer weren't a big problem for Jefferson because they were pretty much harvested pretty completely, and they were so precious that Jefferson had a deer park. They were like animals in a zoo. And he kept deer in a fenced-in area and would feed them corn with his own hands. So deer wasn't a big deal. Like in Jefferson generally gardened in sort of an age of innocence in regard to most pests, because most pests for our gardens have come from other parts of the world more recently and became problems because there's no natural controls for them. And so the deer were not a problem for Jefferson, and he talked about rabbits, but I can't think of any other real animal pests that he mentioned. Today, deer is our worst pest at Monticello today. I wish we had we just put up a sample of that 10-foot high fence, and one of the failures of my tenure was an inability to generate the support to get that whole thing put up. And we have a dog patrol we put out at night at Monticello. We have invisible fences around the vegetable garden, around the flower garden. We put these beagles in at night. And in theory, the beagles chase the deer away. It hasn't always been completely successful. One can see on sort of a video screen of Tucum and Charlie running after the deer at one end of the garden, and then seeing this other band coming in the far end 1,000 feet away. And the story of our deer dogs, which we've been doing for about 20 years, is a tragic comic one, but it has been fairly effective in some ways. Yes, sir.
Hold on, Don. It's coming.
Thank you for being here today. Obviously, there is some attention to the future involved in all this because you have Alice Waters, who obviously has done amazing work in Oakland to engage our young people in the significance of gardening, nutrition, and growing things. It strikes me that it's kind of metaphorical that you're here because two of the things that I worry about most in the world today are whether or not democracy is going to survive and whether or not we're all going to grow better gardens. So I'd just like for you, if you could, based on your experience and given that Jefferson's first love was this intersection of both nature, education, and democracy, what lesson would you like people to get from this, particularly young people? And then what advice would you give about those of us who are trying to create a pedagogical garden here in Little Rock?
Well, I think that the gardens build, like Alice Waters, I think gardens, just like food, build community. There's a real, brother and sister of the spade relationship that evolves between family and friends and neighbors. And certainly Jefferson used plants as a way of relating to friends, families, and political allies, not only through things like the spring pea contest, but he would often begin letters on the future of the American Republic with a discussion of how seeds and gardens were doing at Monticello. And so I think that gardening, not just, home gardening builds community, just like I think food builds community. And I think those are really positive aspects of a democracy. And of course, Jefferson believed in this country of small farmers. He had this sort of agrarian view of the evolution of the American Republic that was based on Greek and Roman models. And those are values that are fascinating to bring up today. But Jefferson's, a complex figure. He's all things for all people. And it ends up when people say, well, Jefferson would like this today or he'd like that today. When people end up talking about Thomas Jefferson, they often end up talking about themselves. But it's really convenient to have him as an oracle for all sorts of different points of view. But I think the gardening point of view is a particularly positive one, and I think Jefferson was probably happiest in the garden. I think there's few topics that tell us more about Thomas Jefferson than gardening. And, we're looking for another model in the future. The next president maybe would become a gardener. That's kind of dreaming on. Can you imagine the president today keeping a chart of the farmer's market in Washington, D.C. over the 8 years of the presidency and when 37 different vegetables came and went in the farmer's market? Or being involved in the menus for the president's house. So I don't know if what was the second part of the question was about teaching gardens, and I think gardens do teach. I think I think you can learn a lot from gardens, but particularly in participating. And this whole movement of the schoolyard garden is just so positive, and it seems to be universal. I mean, I'm sure there's scores of schoolyard gardens in Little Rock as there are in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I think it teaches so many great lessons about patience, about persistence, about hard work, about struggle, about working with others, and particularly about cooking. And the community garden needs to go with community teaching the children how to cook, because that's the answer, I think, for the wholesomeness of our next generation. Yes, sir.
I have a mic right here for you, sir.
Oh, 1 second, sir. We have people that can't hear. I know that we can hear up here, but behind you can't.
Genius that he was, did he make any attempt at a comprehensive irrigation system?
Yeah, it's a great question. He did have a plan for an irrigation system at Monticello that involved running water from his cisterns. And Jefferson had a great plan for brick cisterns that were at the four corners of the house that captured rainwater that fell on the roof, but also that fell on the terraces. But they always leaked, and it never worked. He was always seeking this, what was called a Roman cement that would set up in water, and it never worked for him. And there's no documentation that Jefferson ever watered a plant in Monticello. And he wasn't alone in the sense that other garden diaries by Virginia plantation owners like George Washington or John Taylor, the wealthiest men in Virginia who had large slave forces, they'd talk about how during droughts they'd send slaves out to water their gardens, presumably with buckets. And every time they'd throw up their arms and say, gosh, this was really a waste of time. And if you think about it, going out and, no matter how many people you have to go out and water, 200 hills of sweet potatoes with buckets, it just doesn't do that much good. And irrigation, at least for big gardens, was a little bit out of the question for a lot of people, but there were a lot of exceptions. America's great first plant explorer lived in Philadelphia. His name was John Bartram, and he was a farmer outside of Philadelphia along the Schuylkill River. And he had an orchard of apple trees, and he ran canals from a spring that went through his apple orchard, and then he would pour ashes and manure into the spring as sort of a fertilizer injector system in 1754. Pretty clever. And then there was a gardener in Annapolis named William Ferris who had a smaller garden, maybe 3 times the size of this room, and he would run what he called water tables, which were basically canals, from a well in the middle of his garden throughout the rows of vegetables in the garden itself. So there was some irrigation that was going on, but most gardens were at the mercy of the weather. This is the first summer I ever remember I didn't water a garden. This was a great summer, but usually it's pretty critical to ensuring pretty good success.
We have time for one more.
Yes, ma'am, in the back here.
Yes, thank you for coming, both you and Mr. Smith. This is a two-part question. Do you save seeds, and what are your thoughts on the idea of farmers having to use genetically enhanced seeds and not being able to save seeds that aren't?
Yeah, we have a big seed program at Monticello, and you can Google Monticello and buy seeds that have been collected from the gardens. And the vegetable garden in particular serves in part as a seed garden where we grow things and let them go to seed and then collect the seed, and then over the wintertime we clean and package the seed, and we sell some 50,000 packets of seed a year. And it's a way of preserving a lot of these Jefferson and historic varieties of both the Jefferson vegetables but also flowers. And so it's www.monticello.org, and you can get the seeds themselves. And in terms of GMOs, I don't have really strong opinions. I'm a little confused. I don't really understand the science behind them, and the various arguments I'm a little confused by. So I haven't really generated a firm opinion about the use of genetically modified plants. I know that there's problems that have evolved from it, but also, whatever can help the farmer, I'm a big advocate for. So it's an issue that I'm just a little bit, paralyzed by, really. All right.
All right. Peter,
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Wasn't that marvelous? Very inspiring. I'm inspired to plant on every Monday morning a thimble full of lettuce seed starting next year, and I hope you all will join me with that. And it's heartening to know that Thomas Jefferson had more failures than successes. Makes me feel very good. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I did want to mention that we'll have another speaker next year in the spring, in March, in this Garden Home series. It'll be Todd Longstaff-Gowan from London, and he'll be talking about his work on the royal palaces in the preparation for Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee. So we hope we'll see all of you back here in April. Thank you so much. And Peter will be back here to sign books.